Hey guys, welcome back to the Mentor Nation podcast. It is your host, John Abbas, and I have an exciting episode for you today. But before we bring him on, if you are, and I do this every episode, but it means a lot. If you're watching this on YouTube, please take a second and just subscribe, turn on the notifications so that you get updates every time we launch or release a new episode. If you're listening to this on Apple, just do the same thing. Feel free to just subscribe, leave a review. I mean, all of these things mean so much to myself and to the show and to everything that I'm trying to build. And it just helps me add and deliver more value to you over time. And so I just always want to have you updated anytime a new episode releases in real time. So with that being said, today's guest is, I don't even know how to say, he's just a boss. His name is Nick Bradley, and he's a world-renowned business growth and scale-up strategist. Now, it seems like a lot of words, but I mean, I want you to think about something for just a minute. And he's also the host of the #1 business podcast in the entire UK, and it's called Scale Up Your Business. And if you're listening to this and you own any type of business, you just need to subscribe to his podcast. Now, think about this for a second. How cool is this? Like, Nick is known as the turnaround guy. He's the guy that when this huge business needs to get better or something's going wrong, like he's the guy that they fly in and he goes into a company, understands the entire inner workings quickly. He sees what's wrong and he immediately can implement strategies to either turn the company around, get it back on track, and then grow. It's so imagine like that show Bar Rescue, but instead of some small bar, it's a large multinational or global company doing hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you only get that kind of wisdom from doing this over and over and over. And that's why this episode is so powerful, because he can go and look at any business and immediately tell you what's wrong, what you need to do to improve, and how you can start scaling that business to create, the business of your dreams, to create your vision. So in this episode, Nick shares his incredible story. And then we just dive into some of the principles and the strategies that he teaches to entrepreneurs. It really doesn't matter what type of business you're in, or even if you don't own a business, but you want to, or you want to start a business one day, there is some incredible pieces of wisdom in this interview. So just please take some time, listen, and share this episode with somebody that you know that is also on the entrepreneurial journey. So with that being said, please help me welcome Nick. Sit back and enjoy. All right, Nick, thank you so much for being on the show. It is great to have you, and I'm excited to have you impact the audience today with your wisdom. So thank you for being on.
Hey, John, listen, absolute pleasure to be here. And I've been looking forward to this for a while. So let's get on with it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So for my research, which was really fun research, by the way, in the business world, you were known as the turnaround guy. And I think that's so cool, for many years, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but these large private equity investors would buy up companies and you're the guy that they would send in to turn them around, make bad businesses good, good businesses great. And I just think that the process of doing that as a career for many years, there's just so many lessons to be learned that can benefit the audience today, from mindset, strategy, daily method of operation. And so I'm excited to get into those takeaways, but I wanted to start with your story and just how did you become that guy, and how did that lead you to what you currently do right now?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you've got it right. So I was the turnaround guy. It's funny though, right? I'll just start off by saying that if you go into a private equity world, like you go into the firms, you can't really say turnaround, because they get really upset and they pick up chairs and like throw them against walls, because the most important thing usually is status and looking good down at the country club. Yep. And they don't like to have anything that looks like it's not working. So I kind of was like the growth guy, but not really. It was turnaround. So yes, I give you the sort of the short version, long version piece of it all. I spent 10 years in private equity, but before that I had a corporate career, sort of 15, 20 years working in media and education. I worked for some big companies like News International under Rupert Murdoch, and some really interesting disruptive technology players like Getty Images, which ended up selling for sort of billions of dollars. Actually, it was sold 4 or 5 times. It flipped itself multiple times. It's a case study in its own right. But I kind of got the bug, if you like, into private equity from that experience. And then I went on to kind of be CEO of a number of companies, to turnaround scale-ups, exactly what you mentioned. But I suppose the interesting part of kind of how that all happened is I started my first business when I was 18.
Yep.
That was in the late 80s in Australia, in a little place called Adelaide, South Australia. And famous for 3 things, right? Churches, really big sharks, like great white sharks. In fact, they filmed a lot of Jaws in the sort of cold waters of South Australia, and serial killers. Kid you not.
Oh, I was going to say deadly animals. So
No serial killers. More, well, yeah, pretty much. More serial killers per head of population than anywhere in the world, apparently.
You're kidding.
I know, man. It's like, I'm not
that's not
proud
the one.
of this, by the way.
Was it Adelaide that had it was a tragic one. It was that blonde guy that killed a couple of people. Then he went to like a restaurant.
No, that was in Tasmania, I think. And that was like mass murders. No, they had some, anyway, it's a different podcast, this conversation, but some pretty horrific stuff. But I suppose the story of that is I started my business when I was 18, grew it to reasonable size, not massive. I had employees. I was only like 21 when I sold it. Didn't know what the hell I was doing.
Right.
But personal training back then, it was a personal training fitness business, was never heard of. So these days people go to the gym, they have personal trainers. Back in the late 80s in this little provincial town, it wasn't heard of. And anyway, long story short, I kind of didn't know what I was doing. I scaled it up. I sold it, made a bit of money. But I think because there was lots of sharks and serial killers, everyone wanted to leave Adelaide. So I effectively jumped ship and ended up in Sydney working for Rupert Murdoch on Men's Health magazine.
Wow.
And I tell the story there because I kind of went from this really interesting, creative, courageous entrepreneur persona into this world of corporate. And I did that. I look back now in hindsight, John, and I did that because I was scared of what I'd done, really. I kind of caught myself halfway through the process of being an entrepreneur. And then I was like, well, what happens if it fails? You know, what happens if I go down this path and I never get to what I want to be in life? So I kind of gave up and then did this corporate career. And effectively for 15 years, I was this frustrated entrepreneur living in the constraints of a corporate, lifestyle, if you like. And I had a lot of success in that. So I went up to being sort of divisional board members, FTSE 250 companies, which is sort of a bit smaller than a sort of Fortune 500. So pretty senior jobs. But, if I can be really direct, I was a bit of an ass. I would do anything it took to get to the top. I would, effectively just rip things apart to try and be promoted, make more money. And I had all the stuff. I had the cars, I had the house, I had this kind of amazing job. But inside, I was getting ripped apart. And eventually what happened is this kind of kept building up. And I'd moved into private equity at this point, and that's like another level of kind of ruthlessness. And I'm having lots of success, but I ended up getting quite ill. I started feeling really sick. I had my 2 daughters were born. My wife kept saying to me, man, who are you? I don't recognize you anymore. And then one night I went to sleep. We were closing a deal, big deal, sort of in the high hundreds of millions. And I effectively, the long part of this is I ground my teeth so badly that I cracked the back part of my jaw. It was like I'd been punched in the face.
Wow.
And I remember waking up at 3 a.m, going to the bathroom, and my face was swollen. And I'm thinking, what's happened? Have I caught something? I felt like I didn't know what it was. And ended up going to the doctor and then to the dentist the next day. And they said, yeah, you've cracked your teeth. And the only time the dentist had ever seen this before was someone who was a trader, so financial services trader, who was doing massive multi-million deals. And basically the stress had caused it.
Wow.
So to finish the story, I kind of thought, well, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And what it was, back to mindset and all that stuff, is I was chasing this ideal of money, power, and all these kind of things that don't really serve you. Once you get there, you kind of realize it's not just about that. I wasn't really helping anybody. There was minimal contribution in my life. It was all about me. And I effectively wasn't living to my true values and my true purpose. And so I decided, I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to quit, and I'm going to go and do something totally different, which is the second part of the story. But I'll pause there. But that's
yeah. So I saw in another interview, and I want to ask you just one question about it. So was the catalyst the Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within event, or was that already set in motion and that event just expanded upon what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean that was the awakening, right? I mean, I was, let's be clear, I was super confused. I mean, and there's probably listeners are probably listening. Oh yeah, I feel really sorry for Nick. He's got all this money and whatever else, and poor him. But I felt, how you hear these stories of people who are super rich and they're not happy, right? Really like that. So I was borderline depressed. So anyway, I called up a mate who had retired in his late 20s, a guy I went to university with. And at university, when we were out there playing pool and drinking beer and just doing no work and just whatever,
that's right,
he was kind of going to these events and reading these books. And I didn't know what it was about, but I called him up around the time I had this incident because I needed some stuff. And I thought he was always really focused on this and really clear. And he just said, get yourself to a Tony Robbins event. He said, don't question it. Just get yourself in a room, right, with 10,000 people or whatever it is, and just listen, right? So I did. So I said to my wife, I've got to do this. Booked on the next Unleash the Power Within event that I could, which happened to be in Chicago, and I live in the UK. It was 2 to 3 weeks later, jumped on a plane, spent 4 days just like, why the hell am I here was the first 10 minutes to an hour. Like, I'm in the wrong place. And then by the end of day 4, I was up dancing with everybody, and I'd had this epiphany, which was a lot of what I'd been doing was wrong and I needed to change it. And it was the best gift to finish the story that I could have ever been given.
That's awesome. So next steps, I want to get into the second half of the story because I think that's so fantastic. And I want you to talk about it instead of me sharing with everybody what you do now, because I think it's so fantastic how you help businesses get out of their own way and scale, and just what you've done with your podcast and what that's led to. Believe it or not, the episode that I released 2 days ago was about, should you start a podcast? And I went into it. And so I read your bio. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So what happened? You made this decision, and then what?
Yeah. So I went away and to put some color and context for everyone listening, because people look at Tony Robbins and they think, who is this crazy guy, with massive hands and a massive head and, really weird voice. And I kind of thought that too. But what I learned in those 4 days was that I wasn't really connecting with kind of your emotional decisions. So I was all very head-led. Everything was about, the rationality that I could put on things. And I wasn't really trusting my gut. And so what happened when I was there is he takes you through these different things. He talks about the psychology of why you do what you do and how you can change states. And it's quite interesting if you're into, performance and why people do what they do.
Yep. And
in this one situation, I kind of realized that I was making decisions which weren't really the true me. And I thought, wow, very powerful. Tears in my eyes, the whole piece. I really got it. And I effectively came back and I said to my wife, I said, I'm quitting. I'm done. Quitting this, we're talking 7-figure job, right? I'm out, done.
Was she supportive?
Yeah, because she said, "I'm sick of you being an ass." Yeah. And there's always, your wife is always a great leveler, particularly my wife. She's awesome. But this is the thing I want to kind of get across, because that's all really romantic, right? Nick gives up this job because he's found himself in this, Chicago. It was actually the United Center, the house that Jordan built, which is entertaining its own right if you're into basketball, which I am. But anyway, I came back and I didn't quit straight away. I didn't go into the private equity firm and say, you know what, I'm now not going to do this. I thought, I've got to be strategic here, because I've got investments, I've got houses, kids in school, I've got, a lifestyle that's predicated on earning a certain amount of money.
Sure.
So what I did was I made the decision in Chicago, came back and affirmed that. And then I went to work for 12 months, right? And what I did is I crafted, kind of call it life design. I crafted a very, very specific vision for the next 20 years of my life.
Wow,
what I want to
20
do.
years.
Yeah, 20 years. Really, really detailed. I mean, I just mapped the whole thing out. I just kind of came back and it kind of just flowed out of me, to be frank. It didn't feel like work. But I kind of thought, well, hold on, where do I want to spend my time? Who do I want to spend it with? Who do I want to help? How am I going to make money doing this? What sort of impact can I make? So I did all that. And part of that process was seeking out mentors for the first time. Now, I'd had coaches, sort of business coaches, and those things are invested in you when you're in corporate and private equity. But I'd never really understood the concept of mentoring. So as part of the process, I wrote down 2 lists. I wrote down a professional development list and a personal development list, because I now realized that personal development had to be a piece of my journey as much as the professional. And I crafted out, I said I wanted to be the world's most famous business scale-up expert. And that came from the fact that I'd done all these turnarounds and I'd done all these scale-ups, but I wanted to take it away from just being the guy under the radar and lift it right up. And so part of that was getting really, really good at the business of kind of coaching and mentoring, because I knew I'd have to learn some skills around that. I already had the playbook anyway of how to go into a business and actually do the scale up bit, but I needed to educate more. Got significantly better at strategic sort of the acquisitions and partnerships and mergers. I was doing some of that, but I wanted to bring that together. So I ended up getting a whole range of mentors and investing quite a lot of money in the process. And part of that was the podcast. So I found a guy in the UK called Rob Moore, who's got a podcast called The Disruptive Entrepreneur. It's had 3.5 million downloads. And I asked him to mentor me, and he did. And my podcast, Scale Up Your Business, as it says on the tin, was launched in March 2019.
Man, that's awesome. You know, I originally wanted this episode to be just like, how do you scale up? But there's just so much wisdom in your story here, because you're right. Like, I think for me, and one of the hardest things that people ever have to go through is making a big change that you know you need to make, but you have so many responsibilities that the thought of risking the investments, the home, the life that you've built, it's scary. And so I love you talking about how you did it, the list, like just the strategy. That alone is it's gold. And I'm really, really, really glad that you shared that. So did you originally, I mean, obviously your goal was, to become the largest master of scaling up. And I want to get into that, because I think especially the listeners of this podcast, and I've asked different people, Dave Meltzer, who you had on your podcast, brilliant guy. But I think that's one of the bigger problems that people have is how do I go from a solo entrepreneur to scaling, because it's just like everything is me dependent, and I don't know how to escape that hamster wheel, and I don't know how to do it. And so I know there's some mindset and there's some strategy involved, and so I'm excited for you to get into that. But before we do, I just want to have you continue a little bit. So you start the podcast, you start the business. Like how did you make all that happen?
Yeah, and I'm happy to go into all of the other areas too, because I'm sure there's been lots of people listening to this thinking there is a playbook here, right? And you've got to be a student of the game, right?
That's exactly right.
And for me, it was about unpacking what that was and getting clear in my own head. But we'll get into it. But so the thinking was, when I created this vision, and a lot of it was about 2 things. It was about I need to lift myself up and elevate my identity, and that's partly about what I thought of myself and who I was becoming, and also creating a personal brand, which we'll talk about as the importance of that. And it was about having a platform where I could help people. And I don't believe in the whole saying you help people without expectation, because I wanted to help lots of people, but the expectation was that would grow my brand. And off the back of that, I could decide what I wanted to do commercially around the different things, because the more profile you have, particularly in a certain area, like I was talking about scale up, the more opportunities that come to you. Right. I didn't have to go out there and, apply for jobs, because, I have a platform to help people. And I think it was Zig Ziglar who said, if you help enough people in the world get what they want, you'll have everything you want. And so that was something I learned at UPW, which then I thought I now need to put into practice. So I thought, okay, what do I need? And my wife has quite a successful blog in family travel. And I was never one to think about writing and stuff like that. So I thought, well, what do I like to do? Well, I like to talk. I've been pitching for years. And so, I came up with the podcast. And what effectively happened here is this. I thought, you know what? I'm not just going to go out there and talk about marketing, sales, operational processes, financial gearing, right? Every man and his dog who's got a business podcast does that. What I'm going to talk about is the mental side and the skill set side. So it's the mindset and skill set of business growth. So if you are an entrepreneur, business leader, and you've had some success, but you're stuck, you're in plateau, as I call it, like the hamster wheel you mentioned beforehand, quite often it's going to be a combination of mindset and skill set, which is going to get you free and then get you on a pathway to where you want to get to, which is usually selling a business for 8 or 9 figures. That's the usual thing. And so the podcast really blends all of those elements together, which is partly my journey, partly my education for the last few years, and my interest in the science and the art of what it takes to grow a fantastic business.
I love that. And I cannot wait to promote your podcast at the end of this, by the way, and put all the links there, because I listened to a few episodes and it's just they're just packed with content, no fluff, just straight content. And I absolutely love it. So I want to veer into the mindset part, because I feel like that's first. You have interviewed a lot of people on your podcast, and you've also went into a lot of businesses. So I don't know many people that would have a better firsthand look at where things are going wrong and where people are making mistakes. Can you talk about the mindset part? Like, what is it that is holding people back that you see that's very common that people are doing over and over when it comes to just their thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I always start with mindset. But interestingly, when I work with someone, I can't start with mindset because people need to understand. They first want to look at the things they can touch and feel, right? They want to say, oh, the marketing's broken. Yeah, it's the marketing. Half the time is the fact you've lost purpose. But we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But mindset, there's a few common things. First and foremost, fear is the number one overriding factor. And fear comes in different layers. So it's not one of those things you can just say it's one thing.
Right.
You would argue that most entrepreneurs, when they start a business, there's a certain degree of courage to be able to do that startup. But when you think about that, there's risk, but there's less complexity, right? So, it can be you and one other person in a shed, or like Google, for example. But what tends to happen, right, is people kind of almost catch up with I'm going to use the word identity again. And what I've said and I've played around with this quite a while and tested it with, as you said, lots of different people coming on my podcast, is that it takes a very, very different type of mindset to start a business than it does to scale one. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's because you need to change lots of different things about you in terms of how you show up as a leader, how you understand complexity, how you can kind of work with more agility. But it's a lot about leading through teams, because one of the definitions of scale up is the ability to build a team. So people have fear, right? Fear because they're stepping into a person that they weren't 6 months ago.
Right.
And then they get confused. And then what happens when people get fear? They don't rise up. They don't go to 50,000 feet. They hunker down.
What does fear stand for? Forget everything and run? I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, if you go narrow, narrow in terms of your mindset, then you close yourself off from all the external things that are going on, like the market and customers. So there's a few things here. So what I normally say is, overriding question is, have you forgotten why you started this? And importantly, let's go forward 3 years and look backwards. And what are you becoming? So I say a goal is something you work towards, not something that you work. So it's a goal is something you come from, not something you work towards.
Right.
So you've got to take yourself to that position and see it differently. So that's rising up 50,000 feet. So that's the more kind of, well, okay, that makes sense. More clarity equals, okay, now I know what I'm doing.
Yep.
But then you get into some really interesting stuff, right? So I'm often coined as saying focus is a superpower. So you need to be laser focused on that direction. If I'm going to go there, if I'm going to sell my business for 500 million in 5 years' time, I'm laser focused on that outcome, right? 100%. Laser focused. Okay. And then it comes back to a few kind of interesting things: consistency, discipline. Yeah. Discipline. I actually did a podcast today on discipline, just on discipline, because the number one reason most people don't actually achieve their goals is because they don't do the work. They're not disciplined enough to create habits around it. So mindset for me is a combination of all of those traits. where people have kind of almost lost their way. And what I tend to do is let's get you really clear again. Once we get you clear, we can start to work on performance habits. Once we start doing that, you know what happens then, John? All the skill set stuff tends to fix itself. Not always, but it becomes much easier to tackle once you've got that piece done.
Man, it's just such great advice. And because I was going to ask you this question, because I think I've been to several Tony Robbins events. I haven't been to that one. And he said something that was just the one thing that I've taken away from everything he ever said was it was the most powerful statement was you will always create in accordance with how you self-identify. It's not what you want. It's not what you desire. It's how you identify yourself. And I've never forgotten that. And so I'm just so curious as to when you're working with entrepreneurs and they know it's mindset, you know it's mindset, what are some of the things that you teach them to do, action steps that will help them change their belief system? Is there exercises or anything that you recommend? Is it what you just said, just getting clear on a goal? Or is there things that you can do to expand how they identify either themselves or their business?
Yeah, the first part is to be more expansive with their vision. Okay. So, and it's actually one of the first things that I assess. I call it purpose, but it's really about whether it's the person's personal vision or the business vision, because actually I kind of blend the two things together. Sometimes I'll say, listen, let's create a really compelling business vision, but then we'll start to work on what that means for them. So a lot of people, the reason they go down the journey of entrepreneurship is usually they want to make a bigger impact in some way, shape or form, or they want financial freedom or a form of freedom and the ability to kind of live life on their terms. That's the usual kind of construct.
Yep.
So the first thing is getting them to identify with that. Sometimes it's called the why, the Simon Sinek stuff. But I don't say start with why. I say start with your purpose. And then the why has to be part of that. So that's the first piece. Because if I go in there and someone can't articulate that, over a period of time, and usually if it's big enough, as I said, expansive enough, quite often then that's when it feels like the treadmill. Can you see that? Because, well, why I've got nothing to move towards. So therefore I'm just going to spin. Absolutely. And then I start to get a little bit more focused on their state. So because of my personal training background, I'm a big believer in managing energy. So I look at their routines, and quite often you'll find some of these people, particularly if they've been doing this, sometimes people are spinning wheels for years. I've gone into businesses where the owner has been doing this plateau for 3-4 years, and they're spinning, right? They might be making a bit of money. So it's not painful enough for them to have to do anything about it, but it's painful in the terms of not getting what they want to. And so what I'll look at that is if they're starting to be stressed, burnt out, overwhelmed, I'll start to have a look at their habits, their routines. So morning routines, evening routines, weekend routines. And then I start to introduce what I call a 90-day cadence. And a 90-day cadence is we throw away the idea of annual goals. So you might have a vision which goes forward, as I said, for mine's 20 years, but then I break that vision down into 90-day cadence. So it's what I can do over the course of 90 days, broken down into habits which are daily and weekly, which means I'm making progress, sometimes not even major progress, towards the vision.
Gotcha. While we're here, I want to have you talk a little bit on that, because when I was listening to you in a different podcast, I had to take notes because I was blown away by you have a world-class DMO. Like how you schedule your time is amazing. And I want you to share that because you said something in that interview, and I can't remember the name of his podcast, but you said something that was awesome. It's like, people look at that like it's limiting, but really it gives you complete freedom. Can you just share like your DMO and how you break? I think that is the coolest thing. Yes, I love it.
I like to make these things as practical for people as possible. And listen, I want to be also like, I'm not some weird machine here, right? Like I went on my own sort of journey to get here. But what I found is the results that I now get. I own 7 separate companies right now, and they've all started in the last 2.5 years, right? And that's happened from being super intentional with my time. So what I do, and there are some disciplines here, I'll use that word again because it's important. So I never start a week without planning it, and I never start a day without planning it. Okay, so that's the first discipline. Now, is that easy? No, but after a while it becomes a habit, and then it just becomes what you do. But the results are exponential versus just allowing the day or the week happen for you, which is what
Right.
most people do. So I spend about an hour to 90 minutes on a Sunday, normally quite early before the kids get up. And I start with, first and foremost, I do have annual goals, and I break those annual goals across various areas of my life. So I've got health, and I've got obviously business stuff and things like that, relationships. I have all those goals, but I break them down into 90-day results. So if I want to make in one of my businesses, so one of the smaller businesses, if I want to crack 7 figures for the first time, I know that I have to hit 250 in a quarter for that to be able to be replicated. So you first have to have the success, and then you can ease. So it's a bit like Roger Bannister in the 4 Minute Mile, if people know that story.
Yep.
Once you've done it once, everyone did it. So I look at that and I go, okay, fine. All right. So I've got my annual goals. I've got my 90-day results, my outcomes. What do I need to do this week to nudge those goals forward in the 90 days? So it might be, for example, I'm saying 250K. It's okay. So what level of prospecting do I need to do this week? Or do I need to recruit someone to run that part of the business? Do I need to change the marketing plan? And so I work all that out. And the first thing I do really is I jot everything down. So everything from, I've got to buy some running shoes. I've got to pick up the milk. I write everything down first. So the list on Sunday morning, the first 20 minutes is just a list of crap, right? Good stuff and crap. Yeah. And then I think, okay, well, the important stuff needs to get prioritized first, which is the results leading to my goals. And then I've got my sort of health and my energy. So the amount of times I'm going to exercise, if I'm going to meditate, time with my family. I always schedule quite big chunks of time, which are either for my family, to be totally present with them. And I have different blocks in the week where I have, obviously, when I'm doing podcasting or podcast guesting, and I have like this thing called a strategic block. Yep. Which is always 3 hours, which allows me to step aside and work on my businesses as opposed to getting caught up with the other stuff that takes up. So I've got the 3 hour block for the business, the strategic block, and then I have kind of like a personal block where if I want to play golf or I want to go and have lunch with my wife, I've got that. And so what ends up happening is I end up doing about 6 hours of super focused work per day, right? And then the rest of the time is kind of for my own, and when I say work, it's business-based work. And the rest of the time is about me and making sure that I'm looking after myself. And when I'm in those 6 hour blocks, which are broken down in 50 minutes of work, 10 minutes break consistently, and I time it, I make sure I'm not disturbed in those blocks. So you know how people pick up their phone and they go, I've just got text.
That's right.
I do 3 of those in a row. Then I have a break. Then I do another 3 of those in a row. That's my day done. If I've got lots of stuff on, I might do an additional block of 3 hours. So that's a maximum of 9, but that's when I've got launches going on or I've got other things. But that would be the exception as opposed to the rule.
I love your DMO, and you teach it so eloquently too. It's like we have a lot of people on this podcast that are phenomenal doers, but they're not very articulate at teaching, and you can do both. And I think that's just really cool. It's
I appreciate that.
You teach it in a way.
Everyone's probably listening going, man, like this guy's mental. But, I can tell you right, I'll give the gift to everybody, right? If you can start to bring in a bit more discipline into how you do your stuff, the goals that you have become reality, right? And
absolutely. Absolutely. I was interviewing a guy maybe a month ago, and it was just like that. I asked him this question. I was like, if you wanted to go from 0 to, because he has millions of followers on social media and he's built an 8-figure company and he did it pretty quickly. And I was like, what is your best advice? And this is what he said to me. It was so simple. He's like, do something hard, but not impossible every day for a year, document the journey. And at the end of the year, you'll have learned a skill set and your journey will be so attractive to so many people. And that's what he
cool.
did.
I like that.
Yeah, he just did something. It was something simple. I can't remember what it was, like maybe run 2 or 3 miles every day for a year, documented the journey. And at the other end, he achieved a crazy result. And then everybody wanted to know how he did it. It's just simple.
But I love that story because, in that, just to unpack it, because you've shared it, right? So what's he done? He's taken, consistent action, a small amount of consistent action every single day. He's been disciplined. He's been focused. He's obviously then leveraged that, in terms of what he's learned and also others. But you could apply that very small lesson to most endeavors.
Absolutely.
But most people don't do it. And they give up, and you'll know this from the stuff, they give up before they see success. because they're not seeing success early enough. They're looking for that instant gratification,
Right.
which we all know doesn't really come, because if you do that, you're mortgaging the payback, the big payback that you're going to get later on if you're disciplined enough to follow that.
So true. So I just have a couple more questions for you, Nate.
Sure.
And one of them is a scenario because, and just to give you an idea, most of the listeners to this podcast in particular, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs that are all up to about 3 to 5 million a year in revenue. That's
Perfect.
like everything from 6 figures to that. And so I know a lot of the pain that they're going through, and it's all around what you teach every day, which is scale, mindset, scale. And so I wanted to give you just 2 scenarios.
Sure.
Scenario number 1 is, let's just say you are starting a new business. You own 7 of them, so you know this really well. You're starting a business from scratch. What are some of the first things that you would do to make sure that you have a foundation from day one that is prepared for scale?
Yeah. Okay. So what I have, and I'll try and touch on this a little bit because it's applicable at the startup phase it is for scale up. But there are 6, I call them the 6 peaks of value creation, but there's 6 lenses that I used to look through when I was in the private equity guy. So if I was looking at a business that was attractive enough to invest in, be that early stage or later stage, these 6 characteristics were always the same 6. So they're the same things that if you're going to start a business or you're going to scale a business, you need to make sure you have a plan, or certainly an analysis of where you are and what you want to create under those 6 things. So I'll go through them, but I want to kind of jump on a couple of them that are more important based on your question, right? So the first one, super clearly is purpose, right? Now, purpose is not just about, hey, I want to change the world. It's about understanding where you are today and where you want to go to, right? And that's also about having the plan that's going to enable that. So it's actually more about being precise in what you're trying to achieve than effectively having something which is, a fully formed strategy. Right. So the best businesses that start up, in my opinion, are super clear on kind of the end game. It doesn't mean they focus on the end game from the outset, but they understand where they're trying to head to. Right. Mm-hmm. So that comes first. The second thing is making sure that you have a cash runway. So this is something I'm going to say something quite polarizing here, because I do work in the tech startup space and whatever else, but I don't think I understand why a lot of those companies will go and raise, and I get involved in some of that stuff myself. But you've got to start something with at least a certain amount of your own invested capital.
That's right.
You've got to put your, they say your buck behind you, behind your belief.
Yeah, that's right.
And the other thing I say here is I've had Mike Michalowicz on my show from Profit First, great book. And I believe that any business needs to have a focus on profitability. It doesn't mean they have to be profitable from day one, like Mike says, but they have to have a pathway to that. So that's important. And the reason for that is that I work with a lot of businesses that are not profitable after 4 or 5 years, and they're all trying to be the next unicorn worth $1 billion. And half the time, that's just unrealistic. There's something like 400 new startups a week in San Francisco alone. So, join the unicorn club, guys.
Yeah.
But build a great business first.
That's right. Oh, just to pause you there, Mike, he was too busy for my podcast, but he sent me 3 of his books. Well,
long as you got a free book, he's a good guy.
I got 3 free books.
He'll come on. He's a good guy. He's one of the guys. You get different people. He's a good guy.
Sorry to interrupt.
So that's fine. So now I want to get into the main ones, and these are the really big ones. So the third area is proposition, right? And I used to work, I did a stint with Boston Consultancy Group, and we used to have this thing called the simple equation. And the simple equation is this: understand a problem that exists in a marketplace, very, very clearly aligned to a target audience. The more niched and specific you can get, I call it the death of the generalist. Don't be general. Be super clear. Understand the problem. Know that you can provide a solution for one clearly identified target market, target avatar. That is by far and away the most important piece of advice. Because everyone I speak to who's doing startup, the first thing they do is they have like 4 or 5 target audiences.
That's right.
And I go, you know what? It may be the case that those people come and buy from you, but your brand is not going to be built around that. Okay, so that's the thing. And then the fourth area is predictability. So it's a predictable flow of the right customers driving recurring revenue. So there's 2 really important things here. If you ever want to get your business valued, if you want to sell your business, there's 2 dynamics that an investor will look at, certainly private equity. It's profitability, or the pathway to profit, and it's recurring revenue. So the more that you can create predictability, so that could be subscriptions in a B2C business, it could be longer term contracts in a B2B business, the more you can blend that together, the more that you're going to have early success and probably get rid of the headaches where businesses fail. And then the last one, just to finish off, and this is kind of more in scale up. The fifth one is process, but understanding where you can drive automation, leverage, and efficiency. So most people, when they start a business, and I say this from day one, don't do non-vital tasks. If someone else can do it, like I've got a whole team who does my social media. I could do it, but I focus on creating content. That's a vital task. And the last one is people, high caliber people driven by standards and behaviors that align with your standards and behaviors, because you're going to be building a culture in your business, even if it's just 1, 2, 3 employees. So you better be intentional about that from the beginning, because if you're at 80 people, 100 people or more, you have to retrofit that and it becomes an absolute ball's ache. So they're the 6 areas, but the 2 to really talk about is proposition, clearly identified problem, solution fit, market fit, and then the predictability of how you drive your sales and marketing effort.
I cannot wait to go back and re-listen to this podcast and take like some serious notes. That's just such a great answer. And my second scenario and final question on this is, let's say you've been operating for a little while and you as the owner, you go to a Tony Robbins event. You just have this huge mindset shift. Like all of us, you're just like, oh my God, I realize now all of the things that I've been doing wrong. Now I have purpose. But you have a business that is very set in their ways. You have employees that are used to doing things. Like, what are some of the things you would do right away to turn things around without blowing everybody out?
Yeah, you can't come back having drunk the Kool-Aid and start getting everyone doing affirmations and star jumps or whatever else, and playing, crazy music and having a rave at like lunchtime every day in your office, right? You can't do that.
Yep.
Because people are going to think you're mental. And I can totally appreciate that. Having been to the events, I know what to bring home, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But you know what I think is important, right? If you're the leader of a company, everything you do, say, think, feel, gives permission for other people to do that as well. So if let's say you are that leader who was not focused, overwhelmed, burnt out, stressed, everyone knows that, right? Everyone can see that. You're kidding yourself if that's not obvious. Most people don't think it's obvious, but it's obvious, right? And you can see. And that comes across as the energy that then you manifest into a business. So if you show up totally energized, totally present, curious, communicating, being super clear, right? All of those different characteristics of a great leader, people will also see that. And so what I say to people in this situation is, okay, don't go in there and do the crazy stuff.
Right.
But you need to show 2 qualities, okay? Really important qualities. You need to show maximum competence as the leader of this business. Mm-hmm. So this is the time to reignite the vision, okay? And there's 3 parts to that. Reignite the vision, share the strategy, and then demonstrate what's in it for them. Okay. And then the second word is empathy. So that's where communication and going around and taking a genuine interest in people makes a difference. If you can come back and demonstrate those 2 characteristics without doing any of the crazy stuff, you'll see a performance shift incredibly.
Such great advice. I'm really glad that we had this interview. My final question is, I just want to have you share just for a minute a little bit about your podcast and some of the things that you share, because I know you're expanding into the US as of recently, correct?
Yeah. We'll relaunch one of our businesses into the US, which it's actually called Scale Up Your Business, which bizarrely it wasn't going to be called that, but then everyone said just call it that because that's what it's about. And so that's about going into organizations, usually around, to be frank, 7 figures and stuck, and they want to get to that 8 to 9 figure exit. Yep. So it's going in and doing that. So we've done that. That's been our big launch in the last month or so.
Oh, that's awesome. Congratulations. And so your podcast obviously is all things scale up. So for anybody listening, doesn't matter, traditional business owner, solopreneur, real estate agent. I mean, if you want to scale and you want to know what's holding you back, Nick's podcast is the go-to podcast for that. I've listened to a couple of them and it's just like, oh my, I need to like record the recording so that I can listen to the recording. It's so good. But
I appreciate that, John.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't take that. I'm now feeling bashful, but that's cool.
Well, no, I mean it. It's not to toot a horn or fluff, but it's just, it is really powerful, right? Like, when you can build a successful business, but you've built it by practicing going in where people were or where you were at one point and just spending all of your time there. Because I know a lot of people in industries that are consultants, but man, it's been a decade since they've been on the ground. It's been so long since they've actually been in the operation that a lot of their advice is just so far removed, and like you live there. And so I think it's so relevant what you teach. So where can people follow your work, your latest and greatest content? What's like the best place to start if they want to follow what you do?
No, as I said, I appreciate that, and I can tell that as I said, what you're saying is well researched as well, which I do appreciate that as well, John. So a lot of people kind of, if I go and have interviews, sometimes people don't know much about it. But my whole purpose now is to kind of help people grow and scale, to create freedom, to create wealth, to live life on their terms. That's why I do what I do. I'm fortunate to have created businesses from that, but the change from what I was doing before was just unleashing what I'd done for years, but just making it more accessible. So where people can reach me, first and foremost, I say you start with a podcast, scale up your business. I think we got to, it was number 1 in the UK in the business charts and number 17 in the US. So I didn't quite crack the top 10 in the US, but number 17 was all right. It's okay.
That's awesome.
So I say start there. There are so many different interviews and things. You don't have to start at number 1. I would say go there and just think about what you're trying to do. If you've got some stuff with mindset, I've got some early episodes on mindset. I've got some great thought leaders on there. We balance the strategic with the mindset with the very technical details. So start there.
Right.
I've also got my community on Facebook, which is Scale Up Your Business. So there's a few thousand people in that community. I'm very cautious about it not being just a pitch fest. People go there and they help each other out, and it's really good. And then if people, as I was talking about those 6 areas, those 6 peaks of value creation, if people want to assess their business, if they're listening to this and they're saying, you know what, I want to go and assess it, I have an assessment tool which people can do, which will give them a score. And it's quite interesting because it does give you an area. Let's say of the 6, you're not going to have all 6 things broken in your business, but you might have 2, and it will give people a diagnostic on that. So yeah, that's where to get me. The main place I hang out, if people want to kind of get to me straight away, is probably LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So that's the final piece.
Awesome. Well, I'll put all this in the show notes. Nick, it's just a pleasure to have you on today. And I just want to thank you for really impacting everyone and just giving your best advice today. So it's been a great interview, and I just want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. And listen, I want to call out the great stuff you're doing around mentorship and things like that as well. I think it's one of those things that gets confused in the world, and people don't understand the power of it. But as I said, the change for me was not Tony Robbins. The change for me was surrounding myself with people who were a few steps ahead, who could then help me on my journey. And that's obviously something that you believe in passionately. So I'm very grateful for you for bringing that to the world too.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.